let's commence. So welcome to the fifth lecture of the AA Visiting School Public Lecture Series. Before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land in which this meeting is taking place, which may be multiple lands given the location of all of us. I pay my respects to both past and present and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. So tonight, we welcome Oskar Johanson and Adolfo Del Valle to give us our very fifth lecture for the AA Visiting School Public Lecture Series on Unnatural Disaster. I'll now invite Mon Q, who's the AA Visiting School Director, to introduce Oskar and Adolfo. Mon?
Thank you, Paul. It is always a great delight to introduce you to fellow AA alumni that are setting their own agenda and trying to change the world. And tonight we have no other than the ambitious duo, Oskar Johanson and Adolfo Del Valle. Oskar is an Australian-British designer, writer, and educator. He is a research fellow at the Gerrit Rietveld Academie. His essay, Degenerate Ark, won first prize at the Avery Review Essay Prize in 2019 and is currently being adapted for an exhibition at the Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam. He is originally from Sydney, but now he's currently residing in London. Adolfo is a Peruvian-American architect and writer. He is a collaborator at Raumlauber, Berlin, and currently works at Zusammenkunft on the Urban Praxis project and was a core team member for the Making Futures Summer School at the House for Statistics in Berlin. His work on Making Futures will feature in an upcoming publication, so be sure to check it out at the Spectre Books in 2021 autumn. Now, both Oskar and Adolfo co-direct the Architecture Association Visiting School in Sydney, so it's a great inclusion this year for us, for them to join us for the AAVS Melbourne, where they are teaching Unit 2. In this talk that they'll be giving tonight, Adolfo and Oskar will discuss catastrophic climate change and the limits of comprehension through the lenses of geotrauma and the hyperobject. They will consider the Australian Black Summer bushfires of 2019 to 2020, in particular, a series of events that reveal the atomized effects and the inherent entanglement of climate breakdown with settler-colonial projects such as Australia. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming both Adolfo and Oskar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Mond.
Okay, so I guess we can begin. Let me just share screen. Let's begin, actually, I would say, on another planet, Dune. And we'll begin again with a quote that says, "The highest function of ecology is understanding consequences." For us, this quote is a kind of thesis, a thesis on ecology. So Dune. When Frank Herbert wrote Dune, the first installment of his Dune series in 1965, he began an intense and sprawling 6-book story about a planet called Arrakis by its colonizers and known as Dune by its local population. It was a planet caught at the nexus of an intergalactic energy resource war and zealous interplanetary politics. For Herbert, the books were meant, and I quote, "to produce another view of a human-occupied planet as an energy machine, and to penetrate the interlocked workings of politics and economics, and also an examination of absolute prediction and its pitfalls." The universe of Dune is precise and well fleshed out, inviting one to draw endless parallels with our current ailing planet. Even in its first edition, which you can see here in cover, Herbert used maps to illustrate how those who used Arrakis as an energy machine chose to organize the territory. Here in the map on the right, you can see in the privileged position of a map in the center, you find what's called the polar sink. So on Arrakis, there are these enormous large sandworms which function as the planet's tetrafauna. And these worms produce the valuable resource found on the planet, but they also destroy and disrupt settlements and activities such as mining of that resource. So in the center, they place a polar map because there's a border called the worm line, a natural boundary where sandworms don't tread. And so the center, this space on the planet, essentially acts as a landing dock for those who seek to exploit the planet in the story. So the genre of the series, science fiction, is well positioned to pull back the veneer of a naturalistic understanding of nature and ecology. So Dune is not an explicit reference for our unit, it is one that we share as tutors because it very powerfully explicates and illustrates a civilization in the far future with their own Anthropocene. The Anthropocene of the civilization of the Dune series is not just mere speculation, however. It presents many of the same mechanisms of capital, desire, geopolitics, or in this case, interplanetary politics, and ecological thinking that have come to characterize our own Anthropocene, or at least how many choose to define the Anthropocene. So an argument that is adopted by us in the unit as well is that the civilization in Dune, like ours, is a geological force on the planet they inhabit. In Dune, the moment it was written, it was easy to understand this idea with illustrations such as the one here on the left, where you have these fantastical machines of terraforming. And actually, looking at these machines also required a level of a kind of suspension of disbelief that humans in the far future could have this effect on the planet. But today, that's not so much the case. There is no suspension of disbelief. It's real and immediate. It becomes ever more clear how we ourselves act as a geological force. The interconnectedness, or the viscosity, to quote Timothy Morton, of our relationship with the Earth system has cycled back to us with grave repercussions of our ongoing activity on the planet. So the datasphere. The unit 2 is titled Natures of the Datasphere and has deployed in an effort to write our own narratives about our planet's own, however interpreted, Anthropocene. But these narratives are not fiction. Excuse me. They are built on a foundation of real issues, impacts, and data. But rather than employ science fiction, we employ techniques of mapping. And there are two key concepts of the unit's agenda embedded in the name. We want to reflect on its overtly digital mode of operation. The datasphere is an inelegant term, admittedly, for the interface between the unit and the vast amounts of data to be mined and found all over the World Wide Web. So data produced by enormous scientific endeavors and institutions that take the form of satellites or is collected by satellites and other technologies, or data that's employed by military juggernauts, or, as in this example, real-time data that is used by techno-capital frameworks, or even the data of billions of desiring machines plugged into social media. So the unit, restricted in space and time by an ongoing pandemic, which has pushed the limits of many of our socio-political systems and are a result of those very limits, consciously embraces this datasphere. We tap into the strange condition of planetary scale documentation interfaced by a simple web browser like the one you see on screen. So when Robert Pietrusco states in his paper, A Speculative Cartography, that, and I quote, data is the dominant rhetorical mode of rationality. Popular claims about the state of the environment, the composition of its people, are all argued for on the basis of data, end quote. He exposes a fundamental misuse of the seeming objectivity of data as necessarily producing objective models or maps. A similar sentiment is reflected in this quote that I have up by David Harvey in his work Space as a Capital, where he says, the all-encompassing political economic processes we have come in recent years to call globalization has depended heavily upon the accumulation of certain kinds of geographical knowledge. Right. At no time in history of our species has everyone had such intense access to such an immense and complex body of data and information. The power of the medium is very tempting, and so we aim to remain critical. We try not to forget that though the methodologies are new and hyper-complex, the practice is the same. Mapping and map making still harbor innate issues of bias, subjectivity, narrative, projection, and violence that all maps throughout history have also harbored. Shown now is a still by Pietrusco and others credited below of a geospatial documentary whereby they critique a dataset by NASA called the Night Lights and reveal contradictions within the dataset where there are lights that show no people and there are locations with large populations that operate in the dark. So moving on to natures. So when we say natures of the datasphere, we mean it just like that, in the plural, natures as in a multiplicity. It's a critical embrace of these inherent problematics of map making in order to produce different versions of what we in the unit understand as nature. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay. In Dune, the story over the 6 books, the planet is fundamentally terraformed 3 times over in the space of tens of thousands of years. So it's not a book about one civilization, but many, not one generation, but in innumerable amounts. And the span of this is very interesting because it's a reading of the ecology of Dune and its terraforming, or you could say climate change, as a hyperobject. And this is a key term in the vocabulary of the unit. The hyperobject, as many of you have heard before and probably know very well, is a well-known term coined by Timothy Morton and denotes a polytemporal, polyspatial object whose scale is vastly distributed over these 2 realms. It is planetary, but also simultaneously permeating the everyday individual lives of Earth's inhabitants. The hyperobject of climate change asks us to think beyond dichotomies of built environment and the natural world into scales and intersections that operate through what he calls non-locality, temporal undulation, and phasing. For us in Unit 2, the power of the term hyperobject lies in its potential to point to the advantages and limits of cartographic techniques, to capture a part of, but never the entirety of the planetary forces of the Earth system. Again, another important term for the unit. It is part of the vocabulary of the unit employed to help us phase between precise moments of engagement, which have urgency and impact, and the wider field of the Earth system, whose constituent parts intersect and enfold them, and whose destabilization is being exaggerated and accelerated by the ongoing cascading effects of climate change. Most importantly, the idea of the hyperobject shifts the understanding of human activity, such as the governance of a territory. So research done in Unit 2 so far in Homebush Bay in Sydney has uncovered not only severe land contamination, whose lasting impact can extend well beyond the average lifetime, but also has revealed a system of control and institutions whose complete impermanence denies the possibility of attribution. Governance of the contaminated territory takes everything but the actual expanse and temporal quality of the contaminant into account. Could this image hint at alternative forms of governance and institutions whose responsibility is attached to the lifespan and processes of pollutants and contaminants? Another point of research in Unit 2 so far examines the entanglement of the biosphere, in this case animals, with a dense layer of human settlement in Hong Kong. The research illustrates that green space in the city, from the decorative, such as water fountains, to the recreational, has become the last refuge for wildlife on the island. Complementing spectral data, the students' work features vector layers that reveal the intense inhabitation and carving up of the surface of the water. The zoning of the land extends to the sea. Another research trajectory in the unit examines earthquakes, which themselves are a kind of geotrauma, the embedded traumas of geological formations and catastrophes which have accumulated over millions of years, which continually manifest through and influence the ever-changing biosphere throughout Earth's long history. An instance of which, in this trajectory, reveals the fragility of hyperurbanism in areas such as the Sichuan Basin, located at the intersection of the Yangtze and Eurasian tectonic plates, whose layers of human settlement within a violent active region of the lithosphere stand ready to burst apart. Given this overview of our agenda and working ideas, as well as a small detour into the realm of sci-fi, we would now like to focus on one particular moment or experience of the ongoing global climate catastrophe. That is the Black Summer fires of 2019-2020, a catastrophe at all scales and planetary paradigms imaginable on Earth.
So we know that Australia burns. It always has done. But as the Earth system is destabilized, Australia is going to begin to burn hotter and more ferociously than the people and the animals who inhabit its land can bear. Now, the bushfire season of 2019 to 2020, which began with almost certainly a single lightning strike and ended with the death of more than 1 billion animals, a figure with which we're all familiar, it was not an anomaly. It wasn't in any sense a natural disaster. It was rather, what we argue, a marker of a new order of catastrophe. So the arrival of the bushfires at that time, the end of 2019, disrupted Australia's political discourse. It revealed a number of the emerging but also atomized effects of climate change and their entanglement with colonial projects, especially, but not limited to, Australia. And for a time, they captured the attention of the international press, which seems almost like a lifetime ago, given that it happened right before the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. But I remember very clearly, because I was in Australia at the time, that along with probably many millions of other Australians, the bushfires really prompted one to reflect and try and connect big planetary forces with one's own much more granular effects. So what I would like to do, again, we're not going to approach this directly, that's not the Unit 2 way. I'd like you instead to consider this following list of things: a master drift, strange behavior of the compass needle, a prodigious flame falling from the sky, a heron, greenish weed, flock of birds flying west, freshness in the air, reef fish, ducks, the light in the distance. I mean, to me, this list, when I first read it, recalled almost Borges's certain Chinese encyclopedia, quoted by Foucault in his preface to The Order of Things, which was used by Foucault as an example of the limitation of thought, as well as the possibility of holding contradictory and nonsensical things together within a container, in this case, the container of a sentence. The list is Kabbalistic. It belongs to an order which is somehow mystical and unknown to us. It could be the recipe of a witch. It could be the visions of a sorcerer. But they are obviously omens of some kind of fortune, good or bad fortune. This list was in fact a series of different signs that Christopher Columbus told his crew were evidence of the approach of land during the listless and desperate time between the so-called Old World and the one Columbus and subsequent European invaders would go on to destroy. Now, whether Columbus himself believed in the truth of these omens, we don't know, but we also know, but what we do know is that he regularly falsified the distance of his ship from Europe in order to maintain morale. So he wasn't a stranger to bullshitting. Now consider this list: rainbow lorikeets, king parrots, New Holland honey-eaters, magpies, kookaburras, gangs, barn owl. Think about how equally Kabbalistic this list would appear to anyone who isn't Australian. Most people in London, I would guess, haven't heard of gangs. Well, they might have a slightly different understanding of what gang means. They might not even have heard of cockatoos. But the reason that these birds are listed together does, I think, make each of them into a kind of an omen, a little bit like the list of Columbus's bullshit, because this is a list of the species of bird found dead on the beach by the educator Nick Rita as he walked along it at Malakuta, the very southeastern bottom corner of Australia in January 2020. So found, quote, every few meters. These birds had likely died of smoke inhalation flying away from one of the fire fronts of the Black Summer fires. The dead birds had then fallen into the sea, asphyxiated, and washed up on the beach. The difference between this list and Columbus's list is that there's nothing really here to falsify, because these are, in a sense, omens of an event that's already happened. They're omens after the fact, after the sky has already turned orange, after the sky has already turned black. Now, on New Year's Day, the air quality in Canberra was 26 times the level considered hazardous to the human body. The smoke contained particulate matter with a diameter of 2.5 micrometers or less, which a lot of you guys will know is more commonly known as PM 2.5. So that's small enough that it can enter the human bloodstream and circulate around the vascular system. Elevated concentrations of PM 2.5 in European cities, such as London, have long been associated with health risks, including respiratory disease and impaired cognitive development. Unlike in Europe, however, where the PM 2.5 is derived from the wear of brake pads and of spent diesel, the matter that went into the atmosphere during bushfires was the atomized remains of eucalypt forests and of animals and of houses and of people. So it's the atomized remains of the grave that was made of the entire east and south of the continent. As the fires burned, this matter left Australia. Some of it cleared the Tasman Sea before settling on glaciers in New Zealand. Lots of you have seen the images of the pink glaciers of New Zealand. Turning them pink, then they turned brown. Some of that matter reached the upper troposphere, which meant that it was able to circulate the globe above the Southern Ocean. So in this model, this is not a live capture spectral data, but this is a model of aerosol production around the world. You can see the long tendrils of carbonaceous aerosol leaving the east coast of Australia. This is another way of imagining it. So it would have this matter, as it left Australia, would eventually perform a complete circumnavigation of the Earth. So it was born on the prevailing winds above the Southern Ocean, effectively making a single ring-shaped plume that haloed Antarctica as viewed from above the South Pole. Now, as they burned, Australia's trees released the carbon dioxide that they had fixed during the course of their lifetime, which prompted Guido van der Werf of the Global Fire Emissions Database in late January last year to say that the fires had emitted around 400 million tons of carbon dioxide, which effectively doubled Australia's carbon emissions of that year. And with these trees gone, the planet's capacity to absorb further carbon, of course, was damaged. Now, relief came in mid-February when rains finally broke across New South Wales, but even as they topped up the dams across the state, the rains wreaked havoc. They outpaced the pumps of Sydney's metro system, and being the first downpour in weeks, the rains immediately swept the thick layers of ash on the floor of the bush into the state's waterways. So in the catchment area of Lake Burragorong, which is Sydney's primary freshwater reservoir, where the fires have been particularly fierce, ash, animal carcasses, toxicants produced by burnt buildings and cars, and sediment were all swept into the lake. And this is what prompted the reservoir to be detached temporarily from Sydney's water system. This ash sludge also threatened to produce a second wave extinction event for the aquatic species, such as all the fish and the invertebrates and platypus, and its sudden appearance in waterways was also likely to produce bacteria blooms, which tend to draw all the dissolved oxygen in water from the water until there's little to none left, causing mass fish death. And in anticipation of such an event, there were lots of ecologists running around during the rains, as everyone else celebrated, trying to evacuate fish, such as native perch and galaxia, from the waterways that had already been for years and years and years hammered by chronic drought. So they saved a lot of the galaxias, but they were only partially successful. So that was just, that's what I mean by a second wave extinction event. And by the end of this process, more land than there is in the island of Ireland had burnt, which is how I sometimes try to communicate it to friends of mine in the UK who have no real means of imagining the scale of this event from the UK. I just say, imagine you were driving from London to Edinburgh and the entire country was on fire the entire time. Just that's a means of that's a means of trying to wrap your head around the scale of this disaster. But of course, they did eventually come to an end with these rains. And there were images on news and social media of joyous people standing in the rain with their hats off, mouths open, and their tongues out to catch the rain. The dread that had been accumulating over months, suspended temporarily just in time for the pandemic to arrive. And in its first upbeat tweet of the year, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service announced which fires had been put out and that the firefighters would be going home. So in Australia, there is no national firefighting force. There's no civil defence force. There are no reserves, right? There is no national bushfire database. Firefighting is organised by the fire services of the states, whose boundaries bushfire obviously does not recognise. But the division of the country into states is in part a legacy of the original organisation of white Australia, which was into discrete military autarchies, right? These were each discrete colonies run by the military. And the forces that the state did manage to marshal to fight the fires were made up almost entirely of volunteers. Now, that an event of the magnitude of the fires was met almost entirely by volunteers, many of whom had to choose between showing up for work or going and fighting to save rainforest, scrub, grassland, their own house, maybe their neighbor's house, speaks to, obviously, an individual stoicism and selflessness. But it also speaks to the Commonwealth's profound unreadiness and its contempt for those who would defend its land and its people and its animals. Many of the volunteers ended up choosing a really awful in-between, right? So they would spend a 12-hour shift fighting fires in a suit that reeked of smoke, and then they would go to work. What I would say is that the firefighters' experience of the fires was of the immediate sensation of a hyperobject. Here was not a single event, a fire, that we're more typically used to, but a process, a fire whose footprint was so extensive, one could never see it all at once. Not if you drove for 100 kilometers an hour for hours. It was an event that one knew was there because we had maps and we had news reports and we had chatter on the radio, we had helicopter footage, but it was a fire and an event which one could never see in its entirety. It could only be sensed through its immediate effects. So melting boots on a fire-cracked road, or putting out small fires in the trunk of a burnt-out tree, or the fear that one felt driving towards a wall of a flame engulfing the valley, which is only one valley away from the valley in which you live. So after the fires, the most immediate question was how, right? How did this happen? How did catastrophe unfold with a ferocity that had never done before? How could Australians have so comprehensively failed in the management of their land that thousands had been displaced, that millions of people had inhaled toxic ash, the full physiological effects of which we might not know for years and years and years? That ecosystems in their entirety had been extinguished. Well, this question might be answered by a multiplicity of violences, of failures and denials. First one of which, of course, has to be those that attended the arrival of white Europeans on the Australian continent just over 250 years ago. Now, Australia's original inhabitants have been understood for thousands of years, its propensity for fire. So its myriad nations have perfected the practice of cultural burning, the means of caring for country, and its beings as varied and as complex as the different landscapes of Australia. Burning for country was not hazard reduction or a trick to get game out of the bush, or land management in a sense that might be recognizable in Western Europe. Although comparable effects were among the results, burning was an obligation of the law. And the people of Australia owed it to the land to burn at the right time of the year and day, that it would never burn too hot or too wild at the right place, that it would do good for the land and its own local ecologies, many of which contain species so well adapted to fire that they need it to germinate and seed. But this law came up hard against what I call ship law, which was the law of white Europeans that came ashore with the Marines and the convicts at the end of the 18th century. So Australian law was displaced by the law of invaders, the jurisprudences of an invader. Australian law was then made unrecognized, was then made misunderstood and invalid. And with much of this effort, much of the knowledge of how to burn for country was lost. And in its place was an attitude to fire which was as destructive and wild force, ensuring that burning on the scale that Australia's First Nations peoples had practiced was impossible. So the landscapes they had engineered slowly fell into ruin, fire breaks and mosaics overtaken by scrub, fields of kangaroo grass were lost, the likelihood of fuel load peaking dangerously massively increased. Bill Gamage and Bruce Pascoe talk about this at great length. In the early years of displacement, some settlers actually did practice burning because they did understand its value in encouraging pick, which is an Australian grass that European ruminants, such as cows, really like to eat. But these fires, they stoked were too uncontrolled, too big, too hot. They didn't have the knowledge to care for the land. And so eventually that practice was stamped out as well. Last season's fires really reverberated with the country's foundational violences. No effort to understand them can begin anywhere but in recognition and reflection of this fact. So it was impartial, if inadequate, redress, but after the fires, parts of Australia's media flocked to Indigenous Australians for their input. So lots of Indigenous people put on panels, and then white people started asking them, how did this happen? And what can we do about it? There are, of course, lots and lots of examples of successful cultural burning, not least in the top end. But there are significant barriers to introducing the same practice down on the southeast and the south coast, not least because of the nature of the much more densely inhabited landscape and the local varieties of landscape. There isn't just one country in Australia. There are many, many, many ones. There is, of course, additionally the fact of climate change, which is accelerating, invalidating existing old climate models as it does. So there remains the question of how we talk about recognizing the old Australian law, how we square it with the critically urgent of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, even when the language we use to talk about the catastrophe is so wanting. So language is no match for the hyper-object of climate change. And it's in part because of this fact that my part of today's talk opened with data. The 400 million tons, the 26 times levels of PM 2.5 considered hazardous. All these figures, however many millions of acres burnt. You can rattle off as much data as you want, but at the end of the day, it's an inadequate way of addressing the hyper-object of climate change, the hyper-object of bushfire. So if the first part of the answer to the question of how is found in the colonial history of the Commonwealth, the second part is found by looking at our species' impact on the Earth system. This impact was first made by Western Europe and the US, and it's deeply entangled in the colonial projects of Australia, deeply of the colonial projects of which Australia is just one. But since its independence from Britain, the Commonwealth has become an eager contributor in its own right, and the forfeiture of responsibility, their share of the commons of the climate, belongs squarely to us as Australians. Now, this effort, the sustained effort to unwittingly and more recently wittingly destabilize the Earth system in the pursuit of capital accumulation, is what gives lie to the term natural disaster, which is a superficially morally neutral explanation for the fires that enjoyed currency in the Australian media, even as smoke poured from the guts of the country every day for months. It both retroactively and prospectively exculpates the Australian status quo, no small part of which includes the continued burning of fossil fuels. But the fires cannot be, so that's why the fires cannot be seen as natural any more than any other disaster, the risk of which is increased because of climate change, can be seen as decoupled from human agency. Part of this is because the very idea of nature is hopelessly exhausted. To this, we lean and look to Bruno Latour and also our own students' understandings of natures. So in our own time, we've been afforded every sign of impending catastrophe, first by Indigenous Australians, more recently by climatologists. But we have actually rather been more like Columbus, pointing towards signs and omens, which aren't really signs and omens, claiming to the crew that there is nothing to worry about, lying about our true distance from Europe. We need to start to answer the question, who is responsible for the damage to the biosphere and to human life, which is intimately a part of the biosphere, for its immediate effects, such as the fire, the smoke, for its secondary effects, such as the ash sludge. We need to ask, can this damage be quantified beyond the terms of insurance, beyond per capita calculations? Can it be explicated beyond data, which must never be confused for information? Okay. Will meaningful action be taken with the attention of the world long having since been moved on, long having been occupied by its own local manifestations of disaster in the pandemic, long after the bushfires themselves have been put out? Australia is actually quite an exceptional country. It's one of the world's most profligate emitters, especially by capita, if not by volume, but as evidenced by the fires, it also stands to bear the brunt of extreme climate change. This is an exception to the more generally true arrangement worldwide, whereby the industrialized, overdeveloped North, despite being historically responsible for the bulk of emissions, will be less exposed to climate change compared to the developing world by way of its wealth and its infrastructure and its political stability and geography. Australia, on the other hand, is both the criminal and the victim. It is both the key destabilizer and the site of catastrophe. And this exceptionality prompts the final question. If meaningful adaptation to climate change cannot be made here, or there, because I'm not there at the moment, but there, and if environmental justice and redress for violence of colonialism can't be made a part of it, then where? That's it. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Oskar. Thank you, Adolfo. I'll pass Mon to start the conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for that presentation, Adolfo and Oskar. Very poignant and very relevant to our society today. That's always, I think, in the front of our minds of a lot of people. You sort of navigate through this space as almost cartographers, investigators, and journalists in somewhat form. But you're trained both in architecture, and in a way, the forum that we have right now, it's sort of, I feel like you're already converting the converted, right? Like we all believe that this is the case, but how do we actually have agency, or what do we do now? Right? Like knowing these things, knowing what you're saying, understanding it, is it bringing more awareness about it? Is it to rethink our relationship with nature? I think it raises more questions for me, because now that you've presented this data in this data sphere, in this current time, what now? And I have always grappled with this topic as well myself in my career, because in my 4th year at the AA, I looked at petroleum, I looked at oil, I looked at crude oil, and I realized that how much of our world is actually built on this substance, and that we can't just get rid of it. It's not a simple solution of let's just get rid of it. Let's just, it's a very wicked problem. And, looking at all the students here today, what should they do, or what can they do? Or do we just yell at the top of our lungs like Greta Thunberg and be like, look what's happening? I guess that's a call to action. Like, last year we even saw this call to action by architects, right? Like this carbon neutral sort of stance that they made, but to no avail, to the fact that a lot of the architects actually pull back on them because they're still designing airports. They're still designing these things. And, and sometimes I think it's always hype, right? It's what's popular right now. It's sometimes, it's out of mind because we don't see it every day. It's that one moment back in 2019. And the irony is it's going to happen again, but we never really learn from history, do we? So, from your points of view, I would love to hear what should we do as architects and designers?
Yeah, that's a good question, man. It's a good series of questions. For me personally, it begins with a fluency in the question, in the terms and the vocabulary with which we probably need to approach the problem. It's sort of trying to grapple with some of the complexity beyond just knowing that climate change is bad and it's happening and there's not a lot that any of us individually can do about it. It is a fallacy, I think, to think any of us individually are going to be able to somehow develop a big solution. I think in architecture, we've got a serious pathology of the individual genius, which needs to be completely dismantled. I think it probably is on its way out. But especially in architecture, there's this idea that we can, if we just build this one building, we just execute this one plan, then we've produced a solution. There is no solution that can be developed in that sense. It is a collective effort, and it's an effort made by lots and lots of people who are trying really hard to engage in it, as hopefully and as optimistically as possible. And it's really important not to slip into doom mongering and into cynicism. I think that's really important, because architects are sort of infinitely inventive people. They have the possibility to work with other people, but that's where I was at. The beginning is working with other experts across fields and being as fluent as one can in the language of other experts so that we can have a conversation on the same ground. Not going to a climatologist and saying, well, what about the figure-ground relationship? Because that's that's a nonsensical conversation. It's about saying, okay, we can all talk about carbon. What's the nature of carbon? Okay. Now, what's the way in which we as architects can help out now with our specific knowledge set? So yeah, for me, it begins with fluency and then moves into true interdisciplinarity and dismantling the barriers that we've developed inside the culture of architecture as well, that might impede that cooperation, cooperative effort, and remaining optimistic.
Can you also, Oskar, Adolfo, maybe you can also expand a little bit relating to just what you just said. You talk about that data is inadequate to describe the hyperobjects. So in terms of, from a kind of disciplinary point of view, from the architecture disciplinary point of view, mindful that we also need to be multiple disciplinary or cross-disciplinary, which I think a lot of the lectures in this series also point towards. Would you be able to start to discuss about the methodology that you use in terms of representing or bringing to the foreground the narrative that you just described?
Yeah, I think in terms of methodology, let's say as how it relates to the unit, it's about constantly shifting scales, sort of. This phasing that Timothy Morton speaks about that is innate to the hyperobject. So when students look at just a mine, it's not only about the mine, but it's about the entire reconfiguration of that matter into another matter, which, one thread of research was matter in the form of hyper-urbanized, super high blocks in a city in China. And this is how we attempt to operate as we investigate all the threads in the unit, is to be able to talk about an instance of engagement that is sort of very clear and readable, but also render it in a way and frame it in a way that it also becomes clear that it is a constituent part of a very large network that isn't just about that instance of that place or moment, but one that is more polyspatial and polytemporal.
Great, thank you. I got a few. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Oskar, you want to go?
I was just going to say, part of the methodology of the unit is about getting students to get a handle on data. These are the data sets you can look for. This is the format, the file format. This is how it's structured. Here's how the computer thinks about it. But then we immediately ask the students, which maybe is a tall order, to think critically about the limits of that as a methodology. So get the data, bring it in, and then immediately tell us what the absences are, what the gaps are in this as a form of knowledge. Because it's very.
Did you use this methodology in your own practice as well?
I try to, yeah, definitely. Yep. It's very easy to create beautiful, complex, seductive images using GIS, and it's a little bit harder to be like, okay, all right, am I actually saying something new here? Am I actually revealing something new? Am I just making something amazing? There's not zero value in that, but it's important to remain critical, I think.
I got a few questions from the audience, so I'm going to read this one out to you. The first one is, in the future, to what extent should we interfere with nature? Well, we already know that our hypernetic intervention has caused and intensified most of today's problem. Should we put our resources to look for a good Anthropocene? And should we cease all interference and confine ourselves to conserving what we still have? I guess it's a question in discussions to the last part of your lecture.
Yeah. I would say that it's absolutely impossible to seize our activities or our interference. That's just the nature. We are part of the the planet. We are as natural as a plant, and so is our activity, even though it's artificial or digital, made up of ones and zeros or concrete. This is kind of what, and we only covered it very briefly because it's also a bit of an esoteric idea, but geotrauma always speaks about the embeddedness of geological processes in the biological. So innate, almost deterministic movements of asteroids hitting a young planet or of tectonic plates shifting and rupturing as affecting the very way that life develops, and by extension, life that has consciousness. So in some way, this is a false dichotomy, I would say. I mean, we are, what we do and our destructive processes also at some level are kind of a continuation of a lot of Earth processes. But we have choice also as a species. So certainly there is ways in which we look to mitigate what we do, because we have a responsibility not only to other non-human agents in the biosphere, but our neighbors ourselves. So in this sense, it's important, better to start with that first acknowledgement of just this viscosity, that you cannot tear away who we are, how we operate as a multiplicity, and how the Earth system itself also operates. We're very much a part of it. And certainly there is a problem of hubristic intervention. I mean, I think in a lecture we had earlier in the unit, Lily Carr from Faro Atlas showed a wonderful slide of a certain architect who will not be named, drawing a plan for the planet. Just him in a nice shirt with a red pen and a picture of the globe. And he's sketching over it, telling us that he solved the problem. And not only has he solved it, but we can continue to do all the things we like, and he's found a way to incorporate that in the solution. I mean, this is a level of mania that is incomprehensible to me. And I hope to younger architects in my generation as well. And I think it's interesting to bring in the phrase, not to go on too long, about this idea of the good Anthropocene. I don't quite know how to, I mean, that's another topic in itself, the many definitions of the Anthropocene. I mean, some people really do not like this word, understandably so. And yeah, that's just another open discussion, I would say.
Look, I think one of these notions of nature is romantic, right? Like everyone's like, oh, nature is this thing that's preserved in the wilderness that, you know, but actually this idea of romanticized nature doesn't exist. You know, like magpies now freaking eat from garbage that we produce. You know, like the actual systems and ecosystems that are coming out is natural in a way now that we have been part of. And like, rather than being us and them, we need to think about it completely. I think it's a fallacy of maybe the way that capitalistic society has looked at humanity growth. Like we only really measure GDP as a measurement of human civilization, rather than, you know, this idea of circular economies, donut models. Like we should compare that with what's happening around environmentally. You know, these are the things that we should be considering. We should look at our buildings as ecosystems, or how we play a part in the bigger picture, rather than one-off things. And I think if we all just had that mentality, maybe something could happen. You know, and as I said, like, we're all in a time right now where data is so prevalent. We're collecting so many things, but how do we actually understand it? And I feel like Adolfo and Oskar are trying to do that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but trying to understand on such a large scale. It's like a new way of site mapping that, you know, back in the time, we didn't have this much data to actually capture and showcase. And maybe as an architect, you know, like I always have this sort of pet hate with architects in the sense that they do a building, run in and take a photo, and then forget about it, right? Like they're hunting for that one image that's going to get them in that publication. And then 10 years down the track, unless someone upkeeps it, like Corbusier's Villa Savoye, it was a horrible building. The clients hated it. They freaking wanted to sue Corbu. The roof was leaking. It would be derelict. But because we sort of champion, you know, this sort of hero architect, as you sort of talked about, it's the wrong mentality to have. I think in our generation, we should completely change that notion, and that we should hero things that actually are more of a circular way of thinking. And I think this is a start of a conversation to do that. And, you know, Adolfo and Oskar, your careers are quite young. I assume, you know, you've just come out. It's almost like, how do you tackle with this? And, you know, I want to bring back maybe the sci-fi notion that you started off with, right? Like, in a way, storytelling is so important, right? Like to convince people to actually, like, that's why I think that your presentation shouldn't just be in the realms of architecture. As Christina showed us in forensic architecture, there's so many forums, there's so many areas that our skills could be used at to combine all this complexity, right? Like the last thing you want to see is an engineer talking about this because people don't really understand it, maybe spatially or emotionally. And that's where we can really provide that. We can show visual representations of what we're actually trying to say so it communicates better. And maybe that's another way to do it. I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but I think we need to attack it from so many different prongs that one day maybe it would stick, just from the same conversations we had with Stefan and Pablo last week, right? And we're worried that these things only come into play when there is an incident. And by that time, it's too late, right? Like, rather than being reactive, we have to be proactive about it. And I guess just on those comments, I would try and ask, maybe expand on that, Adolfo or Oskar. You know, challenge me if you think I'm wrong, but these are the things that are going through my mind when you're giving these presentations, and also what I think the students should start thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I think for both of us is what's really important is constantly challenging the terms and the attitudes that we would otherwise just receive. Okay, a word like nature. Is nature even a useful word anymore? Was it a useful word 200 years ago? Do you know what I mean? So, like, given that it's so critical that we understand our relationship to other parts of the Earth system today, it's really important that we are constantly reappraising even very, very simple, commonsensical words like nature. Because if it's not useful, if in fact it's giving us a false understanding or a false division of us and the rest of the planet, then it's worse than useless, it's destructive. The same thing about existing attitudes and cultures within architecture. If this idea that in architecture, as you say, Mon, there's this pervading sense of the hero architect, the Corbusier figure, who produces one work, which, if it's not preserved as a museum piece, decays. In which case, I mean, beyond keeping yourself employed, which is and alive and well fed, which is, you know, very important. Obviously, you're kind of, you know, it's harder to quantify how your effort is being counted. So I think it's really important. That's why in the unit we're constantly saying, okay, the Anthropocene. What's your understanding of the Anthropocene? This is a not uncontested term. Okay, nature. There's a very, very common word. What's your understanding of nature? What's your understanding of architecture? What's your understanding of the role of the architect? Constant reappraisal. That for me, I think for both of us, that's like the foundation for then further action, which is much more practical. It's not just like sitting around talking about the meaning of words. But that's the first step, because it really is like a framework and a way of thinking about the world.
There is a question from Pablo, actually, from last week. He says, thanks for the amazing lecture. My question goes to Oskar, putting you in the spotlight there, Oskar. Have catastrophic bushfires in Australia strength scientists, social movements, activists, alliances in the sense of Extinction Rebellion, or even Stanley Robertson's Ministry of the Future? I'm not sure exactly what he's trying to say there, but maybe we can talk a little bit about, I guess, Australia's catastrophic bushfires and what movements have happened afterwards after that. Or is there any things that we can understand about, or has anything changed?
If I might just make a quick note. Kim Stanley Robinson is another sci-fi writer. So I quite like sci-fi. I think we both do. And he wrote a Mars trilogy, which is like Dune, another series of books about a civilization and their own Anthropocene and their own terraforming of the planet. So sci-fi is always a little bit exaggerated in these regards, and they have their own problematics when you read the literature, but they're nonetheless useful tools of narrative building and examining different Anthropocenes, because they can exist in literature as they do on our planet. But I pass the question on to Oskar.
But yeah, I mean, I know Stanley Robinson is involved in a lot of work about climate change, and that isn't surprising given that he authored, Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, right? Pablo, I don't know exactly about what's happening on the ground in Australia, because I don't live in Australia, and this is doing this work at MSD is like the first time I've kind of properly interfaced in like an Australian educational institution, which I'm, completely honored by the opportunity that Mond and Paul have offered to do so. But I couldn't tell you what's happening on the ground. What I can tell you is that there are practitioners such as Professor David Bowman, who we're going to try and involve in our visiting school in January in Sydney, who's developing the relatively new field of pyrogeography, which he positions as explicitly interdisciplinary. So that incorporates indigenous epistemologies, climatology, I think critical cartography, economics, all sorts of things. So he's at the University of Tasmania. I know that there's a lot of people up in Darwin who are also thinking about this, like in terms of explicitly engaging bushfire and working out new means of managing the land that both make use of indigenous knowledge and can adapt it to the accelerating effects of climate change, which are, far beyond what anyone in this continent, or that continent, I keep saying this continent as though I'm in Australia, mentally I'm in Australia, have had to deal with, even over the course of 60,000 years of constant, of continual human inhabitation of Australia. So it's happening in the universities. I don't know about Extinction Rebellion. I don't know what their interface is. I couldn't tell you. The other groups I can think of are, groups like Melbourne Climate Futures, Professor Catherine Bowen, who we had speak to us last week, to our students. She's involved in that effort. So there are lots of different, that's within the University of Melbourne itself. And over in Sydney, you've got the Sydney Environment Institute, which is doing really good work in report writing. But again, I don't know how closely they're related to efforts on the ground, boots on the ground, as Extinction Rebellion might be characterized as, I guess.
I guess one of my final questions as well for both of you is, what would you like to see happen? Like from this research, what would be your next project? I think that's something that, maybe in the future and where you sort of reposition yourself now, what would you like to do?
Adolfo, you want to field that one? Just tell us your the future ambition of your entire life.
That's a really big question. What I can say at the moment is to continue to seek out, I don't even want to say niche, but to continue to develop and seek out a different role for architectural practice. Something that's critical practice, that's interdisciplinary, that's inherently political in that you are interacting with stakeholders, and something that has a kind of lateral agency across stakeholders, so that can communicate between them, not just between them, but in a way that is interconnected. I think for me, that's quite important. The work I do in Berlin now is this kind of, I work for a cooperative, an urban development cooperative, and they have this enormous project, and they function in this way, this kind of, in very simple terms, bottom-up urbanism, where they have this site that was a site of contention. People wanted to tear it down. It was a symbol of the old East German regime. But if they tore it down very quickly, developers would have moved in with a bunch of towers in the middle of the city again and just added more and more to the drabness of that neighborhood. And so the building was essentially occupied, and there was a conversation that was started across sectors, in the cross-governmental sectors, but also civic sectors. And architects always played a role in those conversations at all levels, from the meetings where they would just make drawings, very beautiful drawings, to communicate a possible future, to the real nitty-gritty of how this can happen, how the materiality and how the building phases can progress to allocate space, time, and experimentation during the building process. So our knowledge is there, it's transferable, it's broad, it's wide, it's specific, but also general. And I think I would like to keep operating at this level. And of course, tackle the issue of climate change more and more as I develop as an architect, I suppose. That's my answer.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, I would like to continue a lot of the efforts that Adolfo and I have started, like right here with this opportunity of teaching at Melbourne, in the sense that I think there's incredible value in thinking through these ideas through teaching, through conversations with, you know, your co-tutor and your students and all the other staff who are in the institution, because, you know, by no means do any of us have the answers. We might not even have the beginnings of the answers. But first of all, we can begin to redefine the terms for ourselves as architects, as spatial practitioners, in cooperation with other spatial practitioners. Then we can begin to engage others from other fields. So, I mean, exactly what I'm doing now, which is doing this kind of interdisciplinary studio in all sorts of new and interesting kind of pedagogical models, as you guys are experimenting with, continuing that effort to Sydney, continuing in other universities, engaging with other professionals, so I continue to develop my own knowledge, learn from teaching. I think that's the most important thing. Yeah, the last thing I would want to do is go into practice and just, I mean, I couldn't imagine going to practice and be like, oh, that's just not an interesting topic for me anymore. And by the way, I'm not qualified because I have to design doors. I mean, it's important to design doors, but you can't, for me, there's just like, there's too much to abandon, and there's so many amazing conversations to have yet. So yeah, that's me, I guess.
Absolutely. Look, I know that's a hard question, especially now, and you know, at the end of the day, well, it's probably morning for you both. But I'm just curious because, you know, like Adolfo, you guys are doing this such large scale things, but actually the stuff that you're doing is spectacular. It's so hyper local, you know, and the things that you're practicing, but having that sort of big picture in mind and actually how is this impacting that, I think such a good sort of premise. It's like, you know, you're not just doing one building after another, but actually you've got this other sort of worldly sort of view that you're actually contributing. And I feel like, you know, we're not citizens of just, you know, our own little sort of bubble, but we're citizens of the, you know, planet Earth, right? And I feel like that's something that I would definitely take away from. And, you know, just following your sort of, you know, relationship with education, but also the free access to information. Right. So I think one of the things that we always do is after every sort of workshop, we freely give this information to anyone, because really ideas are cheap, right? The thing that really takes the effort is the action. So I think we should encourage more people to take up the action and also formulate ways of tackling how we can actually, as a collective, maybe present differing views, because there's no one answer. There's so many multiplicities of ways of dealing with it, because I'll be scared if there's like, there's one hyper object that we design that can solve the whole of the world's problems, because that's when we get into the realms of really disastrous, catastrophic climate change. And I think on that note, I hope we've inspired some of the students to maybe take some action and learn more and also just dig deeper. But I would love to thank Adolfo and Oskar for such a, I guess, thought-stimulating presentation, especially so close to home as well. And I'll want to thank all the behind the scenes from Daniel, Sam, as well as Paul. And Paul's probably going to talk about the next lecture that we have on tomorrow night.
Thank you, Mon. Thank you, Oskar. Thank you, Adolfo.
Thank you.
Tomorrow night, we have our last concluding lecture for the AA Visiting School Melbourne, and it's a lecture given by Emmanuel Coe on AI sampling on plasticity and form. So join us again online tomorrow for the last lecture of the AA Visiting School lecture series. Good night.